Hello and welcome to this episode of Read Play Game, where we look at tabletop role-playing games from every side of the table. Today, we are joined by a very special guest, Caro Asercion, game designer and creator of Exquisite Biome. Caro, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure to be on the show.
We had such a great time playing the game. I think I speak for all of us.
Just before we jump into questions, I work at a science museum, a children's science museum, and I've done like summer camps. I did birthday parties for a really long time, and now I do events. And you might have noticed in like some of the questions beforehand, like, love the game as just a way to explore biology and a possible learning tool. Like, it is such a cool, like, meaty game, and I'm really excited to talk more about it.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Emma. Excited to dive into some of those questions and some of the other things we've got lined up today.
Emma is fantastic at that museum, by the way. If for whatever reason you're ever in North Carolina, it's really cool.
Just as a background, if you want to give like some of your just an introduction or overview to like what you've done, how you got into game design, etc.
Yeah, sure. Happy to dive in. My name is Caro. I would describe myself as an interdisciplinary artist first and foremost. I think I'm probably most well known for my game design work, but I also work in theater, I work in visual art, I work in writing. I've dabbled in a number of different fields kind of over the course of my life. And really, I think there are a number of different origin stories that I could point to as far as what brought me into game design, but I think probably the easiest is actual play podcasts, specifically listening to actual play podcasts when I was in college, because I was a theater kid when I was in college and I didn't have time to be part of a consistent campaign of my own. I had, my nerdy friends were always off playing games and they're like, you should join us. This is great. And I was like, I would like to, but I can't because I have rehearsal. But I can listen to these other people who are playing their own games and get the secondhand experience. And I think really listening to actual play was in a lot of ways a gateway into thinking about these kinds of game design and the avenues of like, oh, you can write a game that is just one page, 2 pages. It doesn't have to, not everybody has to write the next D&D 5e, right? And so being able to think about the breadth of games as a field was really kind of eye-opening in that way.
Yeah, we're all also theater people. We met doing theater, so I think we're very familiar with having to schedule a game on like a Monday or something because that's the only day off. I'm actually curious though, what podcast specifically did you listen to the most?
Yeah, that's a great question. This was the mid-late 2010s. I think the ones that really kind of got me activated in the space were, I did my time with the Adventure Zone, but I think really the one that kind of kicked things off for me was Friends at the Table. I think that was like, really spotlighting a lot of the work that's happening in the indie space. But I listened to, One Shot. I listened to a handful of the other larger names in the space as well.
And I have to say, you're talking about game design, which I know is like the actual like designing the game, but in terms of like the design of like the cover art too was just gorgeous. Do you know that artist, or did y'all how did you collab?
Yeah. So Cy Sweetman, who did the art for Exquisite Biome, is a pal of mine. We've chatted, we've played in a couple of games. We are like acquaintances in that way, and so I reached out as I was working on the game. I was thinking, okay, I want this to really elevate the creature art and like uplifting the parts of this that are weird biology, right? And Sai, I mean, as you can see in the book, but also in the rest of his portfolio, does some really incredible creature design. So I knew he was top of the list for, if I want to reach out to somebody, he's the immediate person who came to mind. And I think he really knocked it out of the park, right? We did a little bit of back and forth brainstorming in terms of what kinds of art, what kinds of creatures, also the range of different creatures, like, making sure it's not all just animals and action scenes, right? Like also thinking about, what does the natural world look like at leisure, or with different stages of a life cycle, right? And so it did a lot of back and forth, and I think Sai really understood what I was going for with the text, and kind of knocked it out of the park.
Agree. Even the color scheme is just like
gorgeous
I don't
to look
know.
at.
It's like a deep breath or something. Like I was already like, okay, I'm leaning in. I'm intrigued.
And I know theater collaborators are just used to those types of artistic collaborations, which is why I'm fascinated to get your take on this. We've already interviewed Tyler Cromrine, who is a dramaturg, who is a game designer. What is up with these theater people becoming game designers?
And Anish, I feel like that's the question I am asking myself as well, right? I think, I don't know, the theater to game design pipeline is real in a lot of ways, right? But I think, it's very easy to look at that, particularly from the how do I phrase this? It's easy to look at that from the performance perspective, right? Like, you think of playing tabletop games, like that's the way that I've gotten some of my theater friends into it, is it's like, oh, this is like improv, this is like acting, just add dice, or playing cards, or whatever mechanics you're using. But I think from a design perspective, we don't necessarily talk about that as much, but I think theater design and dramaturgy in particular, but design as a whole, like thinking about, okay, what is a holistic, curated, self-contained narrative experience, right, from start to finish, whether that is, putting on a play, even if that's just a staged reading, or taking a moment to think about, okay, well, how are we making the choices that we're making, whether that's an acting choice on stage, whether that's a design choice in lighting or scenery or costumes or sound, or whether that is mechanical choices in the framework for a game. I think dramaturgy is really, is a design in its own right, in the way that you're thinking about narrative and storylines, right? It's not functioning exactly the same as a lighting designer or a sound designer, but it's being an audience surrogate. And when you're playing a game at the table, you are with your audience in that moment. And I think dramaturgy is really about asking, hey, what are all of the different things that we could do here, and kind of expanding the possibility space so that you can collapse it into, okay, here is what makes most narrative sense, or is interesting for this character, or is mechanically interesting. It's looking at all of the possibilities and deciding, okay, well, how do we want to do this? What's the choice we want to make?
Yeah, and that's so interesting, like evolving from theater into tabletop role playing games, because theater is already such a collaborative art form. And I feel like tabletop role playing games is just like, honestly, probably the ultimate collaborative art form, just because you're getting so many different perspectives all into the same, all creating something, synthesizing into one big story or whatever you're creating.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think you really see that in GM-less games, but I think that's all also the case in all kinds of tabletop, right? Like, even I think solo games, journaling games, single player RPGs are still a collaboration between the designer of the text and the player, right? Like, you can write a solo game and put it out into the world, but until it is, somebody picks it up and plays with it, it's the same thing as a script on the page. Like, until it comes alive, it's not 100% complete.
I really loved the overlap when it got to like literally acting out a scene in the biome for the creatures. That one, it really caught me by surprise. Because I feel like we've done a couple world building games, and I guess we did the ground itself, and I think we role played that too. But we had made the choice that like the creatures like would not have dialogue. They just, would communicate with noises. And that was like a really fun challenge to have to communicate also on Zoom. Like, I feel like this game would be so darn cool to play in person, where you could really like get up and physicalize it. So I feel like I really felt that synergy in that specific section.
I also love what you were talking about with like the way that mechanics marry theme and like working with that in both plays and like how are we going to execute the themes and when designing a game. Could you talk a little bit about how the initial idea of Exquisite Biome arose and then like how you moved that into game design?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. The original seed of Exquisite Biome started from a conversation I was having. I was having, I think, a couple of different conversations with different designers who were peers, who were colleagues in the space. And I think this was probably, I want to say 2021. I was thinking a lot about Alone games. Alone Among the Stars by Takamo Okada is a single player journaling game about kind of moving through space and really inspired by games like No Man's Sky, like traveling to different planets, seeing all of the different environments, and kind of continuing to move and travel. And it's a very elegant game. You know, it's 2 pages total, I think. All of the mechanics are like you just have a deck of playing cards and a single 6-sided die. And it's spun off a lot of hacks, a lot of games that are kind of continuing to iterate on that theme. You know, you just kind of start from a very elegant framework and let it kind of take on its own shape. And something that I was thinking about, and you know, we chatted a little bit about, was games that are similar to Alone hacks, but incorporating an idea of recyclability or multiplicity. You know, I think a lot of games, you know, inspired by Alone, Among the Stars, and kind of in that vein, really only have, okay, the playing cards kind of correspond to one thing or maybe 2 things. And I was curious about this question of like, okay, well, what if you could decide, like, what does each of these different playing cards represent? Like, this might be a table for, you know, one particular aspect. This might be a table for something else. And then you could swap those cards and kind of have this idea of cyclicality. I think this was initially Takuma and I were really thinking about this idea of cyclicality, and you know, I tucked it away. I was kind of sitting on that and kind of continuing to move on, and I thought, just sort of let the seed sit for a while, and I realized, oh, you could think about this as a symbiosis of sort. Like, okay, you're thinking about taking each of these cards and cycling through them, but they're all still interconnected, right? You're still using the same set of cards, even if you're looking at them through a different lens. And I think from there, the idea of symbiosis sort of led into a biology metaphor pretty easily. It was like, oh, I can make a table of these different categories of creatures. I can make another table that is, you know, all of these features that animals might have, or you know, distinct properties. I can make another table that's like these behaviors, or you know, what size groups they travel in, or you know, you just sort of make a bunch of different small lists, and finding the interplay between those was actually pretty straightforward. And you know, it was filling out the list took a little bit of time, but it was like, oh, the core conceit of you build one thing, you move the cards around, you do the exact same thing, was sort of always the seed. And I think the creatures kind of expanded out or filled out from there.
My mind was kind of blown the first time we did move the cards. I was like, whoa, I didn't, or like when I first read that in the thing, I was like, wow, I've never seen anything like that where you reuse the same cards in a different way. It's really cool.
It's fun. It's fun. And I think, you know, there are you know, another game might say, okay, you've made this creature, you're done, set these cards aside, draw 3 more, and just rinse and repeat in that way. But I think, particularly if you're thinking about a biome and the way that these cards are, you know, these creatures are interconnected, there's something really meaningful about the idea of, oh, these are all you know, it's a cycle, right? It's overlapping and interconnected very deeply in that way.
An integrated ecosystem.
Absolutely.
I personally, as somebody who studied biology in college as well as theater, was struck by how comprehensive the environment and animal traits list was. Like, I struggled to think of exceptions to the combinations that wouldn't produce an animal that already exists. So I'm actually kind of curious, how did you research and kind of decide what to include in those trait lists?
Yeah, I'll be honest, like coming up with the environments was the hardest. Like that was like I made a list of like I'm gonna write down as many environments as I can, and then I realized, oh, some of these overlap a little bit. I should probably like do a little bit more research. I kind of went on a Wikipedia rabbit hole of like, okay, what is how do we define a biome? Right? How do we frame a particular thing through that lens? Can some of these be a little bit broader? Can some of these be a little bit vague? Is it okay if there's overlap? And sort of ultimately landed on, I think that's all right, right? I think with the creature descriptions and traits, honestly, I just wrote up a list of as many as I could. First, like what can I come up with off the top of my head? And I think I managed to come up with probably the majority of that list was maybe not exactly one sitting, but it was pretty easy. And then I think there were a couple where I was like, oh, what's the last thing here, or what are the final things to consider in that way. So it's one of the things that I think is really interesting, which is not necessarily a piece of mechanical design that was intentional, but I like thinking about, is I didn't put as much thought into this. I could have gone really, really in deep with it. Is if you have one card as the first card, for example, it's like, oh, this is what niche it fits in the biome and what species it is. That card can't be used for any of the others, right? So there's a minor bit of exclusion that's happening, and the probability is very low. Like if you draw the 9 of clubs, for example, like you could still draw the 9 of spades, and like you would still have a black 9 for that second card, right? You would still have a 9 for the final environment behaviors, right? But there is something really interesting of like, oh, I'm taking this card off of the table in a way that means that it kind of has to be one of these other things instead. So I was a little bit intentional in a couple of spots about, I want to make sure it's more likely that like some of these are going to happen than others.
When you were deciding these mechanics and whatnot, were you able to like test play it? Was it ever different and then you like changed it to that, or has that always been part of the like design?
Yeah, that's a great question. My playtesting process for Exquisite Biome was, I would say, pretty straightforward. I did playtest it a couple of times. I wanted to make sure, I don't want to just like put the full draft out without having any chance to make sure that it works. I shared it with a couple of close friends and, folks in the design space to ask them, would you mind giving this a go? See if this works, see if this is interesting. And most of them were like, this seems neat. This seems like it has legs. A lot of legs, any number of legs.
Right.
But when I did a couple of group playtests, I think the thing that really came out of playtesting in that way was this idea of scenes, right? And this idea of, oh, how are we framing what a scene is, right? Like this could be, your David Attenborough nature documentary, like, oh, the mighty creature, struts about the space and hunts down these it stalks its prey, right? Or you could do something that is more, a field biologist kind of in the environment recording, in a more journalistic way, right? Or you could play, in a way that completely pulls that human context out. Like, oh, we're just going to narrate from the perspective of this creature, right? And I think with playtesting, the thing I really found was leaving space for that flexibility in terms of what kind of scene players wanted to describe, but also offering enough scaffolding of like, this is a thing that could come up, right? This is a way you might engage with thinking about showing a day in the life of these creatures. And ultimately, thinking about how they interplay with each other, right? Like, I think the very first playtest that I did, there wasn't an official, like, final scene. There wasn't a final, like, oh, you put all three of these creatures, officially on screen or on stage together in that way. And some of the players were like, hey, you need to do this. Like, you've made these three creatures. Why are they not?
It's satisfying.
And it was implicitly there. I think, like, by the time we got to creature 3, people were already doing that, and it was like, we're doing this. Why is this not in the text? And so, I think playtesting really, really invaluable in terms of framing and just helping hone, okay, what is the final vision of this text in that way.
I do think that flexibility is so crucial because, like, we having, all being theater performers, very much, I think, gravitated toward a more dramatic rendering of the scenes, literally, literally acting out what the animals were doing. But in what we were talking about earlier with theater being a collaborative, theater and tabletop role-playing games being collaborative from all sorts of perspectives, like, I think it is extremely important to have the option to not do that for people who, A, might not be as comfortable role-playing, or B, just think about it in a different way. Think about it from more of an overhead perspective, or more specific than, like, an overall improv exercise, if that makes sense.
Totally. When I was writing Exquisite Biome, one of the things I was really trying to be a little bit intentional about is, I think I realized very early on, oh, this could be a single player journaling game, right? Or it was pulling again from those Alone Among the Stars hacks, those, like, single player journaling games. But I was realizing pretty quickly, oh, this, has the framework of a solo game, but it's also has the potential to be really, really collaborative, right? And I think that kind of collaborative play is always what I am most interested in. I always like having a scene partner, or having, being able to bounce ideas off of somebody else at the table. And so trying to design something that worked as a solo game, but also, had enough prompts and had enough framework that somebody could sit down with it as a journaling game and say, I'm going to play this single player. I'm going to, write out these creatures. I'm going to go in depth on my own, draw all of these, go fully into that space. And also works just as well if you say, no, the 3 of us, 5 of us, however many people are going to sit down, and over the course of, an hour, we're going to create these creatures together. It was a really fun exercise in thinking about something that works for scaling up and down with the number of players in that way.
One of the things we discussed while we were playing was exactly that, like the idea of someone doing this by themselves and using it, because it's fun to collaboratively make these creatures and do all that, but it's also, to us, seemed like a really useful tool for something like if someone was trying to come up with creatures for, like, a homebrew, like, fantasy world they're trying to do for their own, like, TTRPG or anything like that. Do you know, like, talking about, creating it for solo players, like, do you know anyone who's, like, used it to make creatures for their own things? People who've talked about that?
Yeah, I know a couple of folks who have. I think a couple of my friends mentioned, like, oh, we are doing a homebrew game in this other system, and one of our players couldn't make it, and so we, pulled out Exquisite Biome off the shelf. So I think it really lends itself in that way to that flexibility. And, I think, again, like, the broadness of the space of, is this, this could be a fantasy, like, these could be fantasy creatures, these could be in the science fiction space, like weird aliens, right? Like, I think you could pull in a lot of different ways, and it lends itself well to being a little bit, I don't want to say fully setting agnostic or genre agnostic, but it lends itself in that way. And I've used it a couple of times in, like, my own home games. And so I think it seems like a fun way, and it, also builds player investment, and, like, oh, we all got to have a hand on these creatures. and then they get to show up on screen, and it's like, yeah, we did that.
Yeah, that's always the coolest thing when you do some sort of collaborative world building and it finally shows up. I could definitely, with the fondness we had for like some of our creatures, especially the Renorox, I could see that showing up in one of our, yeah, Emma made a zine of it. You want to show it off?
Real quick. You can download this zine at the link in our bio. But yeah, I drew the little creatures. We also got commissioned art of the Renorox.
Oh, this is
But
incredible.
That's
I
the
love
little
this.
Renorox. And then we have the tunneling harvest moles having their little work day. And the cacterers getting prey.
Oh, that's great. That's great. I love this.
Well, just on the Renorox, my favorite, I think, descriptor was the idea of mesmerizing eyes. Was that the adjective? Mesmerizing? And folkloric. Those, I was like, it's just such a cool way of blending things I can visualize and have an immediate reaction to, and biology. Like, I feel like I open a biology textbook, I'm not about to read folkloric somewhere, but it's such an important, you know what I mean? Way of like animals and biology actually in practice instead of just like in study. So I thought that was so cool. And that's probably why the Renorax was such like a favorite, is because we ended up doing this like hidden eye type thing that they reveal it. So just your creativity and the traits, I think, really helped us like get our imagination going and blossom.
One of the things I was really I actually struggled with a little bit was, I think, in that, the last card, like thinking about those particular descriptors like folkloric, or I think invasive species is another one, or I think one of the things I was really trying to balance with those was how many of these are coming from an anthropological lens. Like, how many of these are being like, oh, this is what people would project onto this, and versus how many of these are more specific, is inherent to the creature. Like, oh, sexual dimorphism is like, okay, these creatures maybe have 2 or 3 different sexes or whatever. It's like, okay, you can frame that in biology, but the moment that you're introducing, oh, there is culture surrounding these, whether that is something like folklore, whether that is, oh, what do humans, or people of whatever your setting is, are there people here, and what are they projecting onto these creatures? There's a very subtle distinction in terms of like, how are we thinking about this, and who is doing that thinking, right? How do people come into the space?
I love that. And I think it bridges to a question that I've been really thinking about a lot in both when we played the game and just a lot of my work recently has been around it, of like the idea of queer ecology and queering ecology, in that like humans place so much of our own societal understandings onto the world of biology. And I found it really interesting while we were playing the game, because I talked about it and we spoke about it. And when we were doing the Renorox scene, we were, I think, pretty purposeful with like using pursuee and pursuer versus like sexes and such. And then that fell out the door when we were doing our tunneling harvest mole, and we had like a little domestic life, because it's so hard to avoid just such ingrained systems, even when there's like a purpose behind it. But I thought that the game was so wonderful in like showcasing the diversity in nature and leaving a lot of that open. Was that a like purposeful aspect of the game, or was that just lived experiences? When you write a game, it comes through?
Yeah, I think the open-endedness was definitely intentional. I will say, the concept of queer ecology is, I'm kind of broadly familiar with it. I don't think it was like textually, intrinsically, I didn't sit down and say, I'm going to make a game about queer ecology in that way per se. But I think, one of the goals that I had was not framing it as textually, or I didn't go in intentionally trying to make it intrinsically or textually, any queerer than nature itself, right? But I think nature itself, has a queerness, right? Like I think again, if we're thinking about this outside of a, an anthropologic, like human-centered lens, it's important to recognize that like, hey, nature is weird. It's weird and it's great, and there are so many different things that, if we're just trying to apply our own limited cultural like perspective on, we're missing out on so much of the beauty of the natural world. And that was really a thing I was trying to elevate. And there were some moments of like, I want to use some intentional language here to push at that or frame that in that way, right?
You cracked me up, Emma, because your example, you were talking about like some fish, the one with the light, maybe? I don't remember. But
we did talk about
anglerfish.
anglerfish.
And you were like, yes, they'll be like, oh, the man anglerfish. It's like, that's a fish.
It's just a fish.
It's just a fish.
That was really interesting at the museum Emma works at. They had a Pride event, and one of our friends was tabling at it with a book of just different kinds of bugs and like the way that like sex manifests in them. And there are just some completely wild ones that exist in real life.
Yeah, bugs are weird, freaky little perverts. See, even that, like I am like the use of like I'm projecting onto that, right? Like that's anthropological, like human-centered thinking at work. But also they're weird and they're great. Bugs are so fucking weird. I love bugs. Bugs are fascinating.
Well, Emma, do you want to talk about the like activities that you've led kind of similar since you brought up the event?
Yeah, absolutely. I've done
seamless transition.
Seamless transition. Less so at recent events, more so when I was doing birthday parties and summer camps a lot. We had space themed things, and a common activity that we would run was we would have, as a group, we would imagine a planet and like, let's talk about what the planet looks like in the atmosphere and everything. And then all the kids would design an alien. And sometimes, a lot of kids draw the Among Us alien. But then you get some really good stuff. Yeah, you get some really good stuff in there. So when I was playing this game, I was like, whoa, this is such a powerful, or it has the potential to be such a powerful learning tool. And I was looking through your other games online, and I saw a review from someone who had used it in the classroom, and I thought that was really, really cool. So another question is kind of a two-parter. Did you envision it as a learning tool or as more of an imagination exercise? And then actually, we'll start with that. Did you envision it as a learning tool or more of an imagination exercise, or a marriage of the both when you were making it?
Yeah, it definitely has a bit of like, I don't know. I think games as a tool for learning and as a tool for play are something it's a thought that I roll around in my head and a lot when I'm trying to get to sleep, right? But I think the thing that I came away particularly with Exquisite Biome is like, it could be a biology tool. I don't know if I would use it as a biology educational tool, right? Like we're not, I think Anish, you said like, oh, you could play a game where you like draw these 3 cards and it's like, is there a creature that matches these, this particular spread of traits and features? But it's not, anytime you're bringing imagination and kind of inventing things into the space, I'm always a little bit hesitant to, I don't know. I don't want to project any air of like, oh, I'm a biology expert, right? Like I don't have any, formal training in that. Like I'm a theater major who makes games, right? Like I think there is a desire to name up front that, the thing I'm doing is conjuring and from a very imaginative space more than anything grounded in fact or, rooted in a particular scientific truth. But I think, as a creative writing tool, as a tool for getting people to start thinking about that space. I think one of the things that games do really, really well is opening up, okay, well, okay, now I've made up these creatures. These are really great. I want to know, how might this function in real life? Is there a creature that, exists in the real world that's pretty similar to the Renaraks? How would this creature exist? And then maybe you take like that research and you project it back into the fantasy game. But it's games are a great springboard into education and knowledge. I'm a little bit hesitant. I don't necessarily write games to be a teaching tool per se.
I do think that it is valuable, especially at that age, to, like you said, open, like, at the very least, yeah, play and open up your mind to thinking about that. Because otherwise, like, as a kid, especially like me as a kid, I wouldn't have thought about a lot of those things. And what we talked about with queer ecology, sort of encouraging from an early age that, like, there's more to it than you might just initially assume or from what you already know. So I think that, like, in that, the definition of what's educational, I think, can be stretched a little bit, because an education can be just like developing your brain in a certain open ways, if that makes sense.
Oink, oink, biome. Moo, moo, biome.
What?
Exquisite biome.
I don't
Exquisite
know
biome
that.
makes learning fun.
Absolutely.
Zoo pals?
That's
Okay.
Oh, Zoop!
It's Zoo
okay,
Pals. I
okay.
didn't. I
They
didn't
make
know.
eating fun. Sorry.
Okay.
Very valuable use of our interview time. Me sitting on it like they're gonna love this.
We didn't hit on this earlier, and I know we kind of wanted to when we were looking at game design in terms of hacks. So to draw it back, I agree with what you're saying of, like, the game on its own feels like more of an imagination exercise, and then perhaps with a pairing of, like, let's learn about this and then put it into motion. Because one of the hacks that I don't think is in there, but I would be interested in playing, or not hacks, but extensions, the evolutions, is an evolution hack, or an evolution where you go back in time. And it's like, we have these three creatures. What did they look like this many years ago?
That's fun. That's a fun one to think about. Yeah, it's like, oh, how, you think about horses and birds, right? Or what is yeah, it's like, oh, this creature used to be, 5 times larger than it is now, and now it's, domesticated. Or thinking about the way that evolution happens. I think I mentioned in the game, there's a list of, like, touchstones and inspiration, and I think a lot of those were really thinking about those ideas of evolution, like, hey, how does a creature change, and how does it adapt to its environment, right? Like, I think the environment is a really important, like, it's the first thing you do, and I think a lot of players tend to, like, the creatures are the focus, right? But I think what you set down for your environment is laying that framework for the rest of the game in a really important way. And I think it's worth not just breezing past that and being intentional about, okay, what's the literal space that we're putting these creatures and situating them into.
Yeah. Well, what was the specific one we got again? We got, because what were the specific cards? Because we had, do y'all remember?
For what? Which creature? Or the
Not for the
environment?
creature, for the environment.
Oh, Mesa and then dry and arid.
Well, we ended up on a mesa because we got high altitude and something else, I think.
Low humidity. It was dry. It was cool.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what got us to, it's probably high altitude, I think. And that's how we got Mesa, I believe.
Well, high altitude is one of the cards in the environmental detail. Yeah. And then, yeah, so, like, that would definitely, like, so much of how we designed, like, the Renorox's thing was that it, like, goes up the mesa or something like that. And that, like, so many of those features, I think having that evolution background in mind really, like, extends it from, you can think of creature traits all day, but, like, I think that also extends it to not just the what of the creature, but also the why, which is really, really fun.
That was a particular interest in us playing the game. Like, I loved the section at the beginning that's like, this can be taken as realistically or as fantastic as you want it. And we decided to go pretty realistic because, work at a science museum, love to dig into that. But I like the flexibility there where you can play openly as well.
Yeah, and I think like that flexibility and that connection to the environment like really shines through. Like, you don't get the scene of the lone Renorox like making its slow ascent up to the top of the mesa, as part of its, the end of its life cycle without all of the things that lead up to it, all of the environment, all of the like interplay with all of those pieces beforehand, right? It's all connected in the natural world.
I mean, it's a lovely system, and we had so much fun with it. We really wanted to explore the evolution section, but I don't think we had time. I'm curious if you've seen more evolutions of the game online. Like, have you seen any hacks or expansions that's you took particular note of?
I have not seen a lot yet. Like, I think the system and the framework of like trading multiple cards or cycling through is one that I would love to see more people playing around and engaging in that space. I think a couple of people might have done things that are, dabbling in that space. I think there were a couple of people who are at various points mentioning like, oh, I want to do, like what is the floral equivalent of Exquisite Biome, or I don't know. There's part of in the back of my mind. I have like one day I'll write the Pokemon hack, right?
We were talking about that.
But like, what are all of the different ways that you can riff on? What are the different ways you can make all of those creatures? And like, I think somebody could just play Exquisite Biome like straight as Pokemon, right? Like, it's not, the visual style doesn't match, but like it's doable, right? In a very real way. Just add another card for like, oh, what's its typing, and you're done, right?
This reminds me a lot of the conversation. I thought of this earlier, but forgot to say it when we were talking about like possible education tools or like its appeal to kids. Obviously, a Pokemon game would have a huge appeal to kids because 90% of kids are already making up Pokemon half of the time anyway. So I remember when we talked to Tyler about single unique power, it was really interesting because Tyler talks about teaching classes at a university, and also play tested his game a lot with kids. So I think that is also a valuable, that's just another way that it's a valuable tool for education, I think.
Education for game designers, because kids are...
Well, game designers and kids,
Kids are ruthless, yeah.
The kids are, they're going to come up with like a Pokemon that's just a gun or something. I don't know.
Ha!
Not that there's not those.
We're close to time. We had a couple last questions. I did want to touch on art before we get to the last questions, because we spoke at the beginning about just how incredible the art in the game is with the illustrator that you worked with. And after playing it, I think I talked about this when we were just discussing the game. So I was like, I would love to do a version of this where I'm playing with a bunch of artists. I'm a doodler. I love doodling.
The zine was lovely. Like that's great. Like when you put that in the show notes, like people should look through. It's good. It's a great time.
Thank you. But I love the idea of like sitting with artists and drawing and maybe doing like comics instead of the scenes. Have you played with the artist, maybe with Sai, who you worked with on it? Like when you were drawing those, taking the traits and translating them visually is so interesting and compelling. What do you think that creating art of these creatures can add to the experience of the game?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's definitely a space that is ripe with potential. Like you say, I think, I've had a lot of, people, there are occasionally people who like will play the game and tag me on Twitter and say like, hey, I drew these creatures, right? Or, I'm posting art of, the things that came out of my game. I don't want to make that a demand that is baked into the game. Like I think, in the same way that not everybody is comfortable with acting, I think there's a lot of people who think they can't draw or feel like they aren't, they don't have that confidence, or I just haven't built up that muscle, and I certainly don't want to make that a requirement, but I think it's great when people do. I think more people should, especially because it is such a fantastical space. Like, there's no wrong thing of what a Renorox looks like. Like, you draw that on the page and that is what it looks like because it's your creation, right? And I think, that is very much the case with all of the other creatures or illustrations that I've seen. It's not stemming from, oh, this has to be biologically accurate, quote unquote, or anything like that. It can be whatever it looks like, and whatever you draw is correct. I've played a couple of games where we'll doodle a little bit as we go. I don't think I haven't had the fortune to sit down and be like, oh, we're gonna like draw all of these very intensively and deliberately. I think maybe that's just a style of the people that I play with. We get so invested in like describing the creatures that it's like, oh, we've got to the end of the game, and we have these half finished sketches that we completely forgot to do as we were going, right? But I think people who are really excited by, and again, this kind of goes back to that idea of engaging with the game in multiple different ways. Like, some people are visual learners, some people are visual players, and finding that distinction of like, how can you make a game that is flexible and kind of appealing to everybody in that way?
We have sort of a bunch of questions that are kind of related to the same thing, so I thought maybe we could bundle those up into like one big question about game recommendations. Is that
and you've spoken about this, I think, in other interviews, like games that inspire mechanics in the games you design too.
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking about this of like, oh, what feels similar but not the exact same. I think the immediate game and designer overall, but game specifically, that comes to mind is An Altogether Different River by Aaron Lim. It's a world building game. It's a map drawing game, but it is two different maps of the same place. One, in these younger characters, and one kind of in the future. And it's players go back and forth. Some people are the people who have stayed in the town, who've kind of really seen all of these changes, and some people are the ones who have gone away and are coming back and seeing what's changed. And scenes take place both in, you kind of alternate between the present and the past to see, okay, how have we related to this space in that way? It's a really, really great, I think it inspires a lot of very similar things to Exquisite Biome in my brain. All of Aaron's games are great, but Altogether Different River is, I think, the one that, particularly if we're thinking about drawing and visual art and kind of like expression in that way, immediately comes to mind. I think as far as other designers who are doing very exciting work and similar creative work in this space, Viditya Valetti is another designer who's done some really, really great work. I think Viditya's games are definitely not just focused on creation. I think the ways that they're focused on creation are maybe not all quite as self-expressive in that same way, but there's a very strong like creative style that really shines through in his work. Actually, as I'm saying that, I'm realizing I'm thinking of games that are kind of pushing back on that. Viditya wrote a game called Space Goblins, which is about a bunch of goblins in space, and one of the core mechanics is using Lego bricks. Like you have a bunch of Lego at the table, and you build out your little spaceships or your mechanics as you go.
Funky mechanics. Mechanics are so cool.
One other designer, I'll list off two other designers real quick. Rufus Roswell and Etta Mendez, I think, are doing really, really conceptually interesting work in the space of games as tools and tools as games. To, I think, take slightly different tacks to their work, but Rufus was really drawing from a place of poetry and, thinking about system as, how do I phrase it? System as poetry, and kind of exploding what the definition of a game has the capacity to be. And Edda's is great. Edda's games are very much in that tool. Here is an object that doesn't necessarily have a definite, like, this is the thing that you do with it. Here it is, take it or leave it, use it however you want. And I think is really, I don't know, fun to think about, particularly in conversation with some of these other designs that that I'm recommending.
Gorge. Speaking of designers, do you yourself have anything to plug, or like recent releases? Anything you want to share with the listeners?
Sure. I'm happy to do my standard 30-second plug. If you're interested if you've enjoyed this interview, if you want to see more of my work, you can find it at seaexcursion.itch.io. That's SEA Excursion. The most recent game that I put out earlier this year was Last Train to Bremen, which is a game that came out this spring. It's a game for 4 players exactly. It's about a messy band who's on the verge of breaking up, who are trying to outrun a deal with the devil that has gone horribly wrong. It uses liar's dice as a core mechanic, and over the course of play, everybody tears each other apart. It's a romp. It's a dark comedy. It's a very fun time.
Got me licking my chops. That sounds fun. Well, I want to make sure we respect your time and get you out here. So thank you again so much for waking up early.
Thank you.
For taking the time.
Thank you all so much for having me. This has been a real joy and a pleasure.
That's it for the interview. As we say, we will see you on a different side of the table.